In the early opening phases of the external components portion of the invasion, occurring at the Loredo battle, where Group Armies 7 through 13 were now making headway inland into the country. At the Loredo battle itself, as the first of the 112th Cav had been unloaded at its bivouac area or temporary staging area and campsite, it had been heavily bombarded by artillery coming from the 43rd PLA Artillery Brigade, part of the 10th Group Army, a group army in China's large ready reserve of group armies, having been specially mobilized for this invasion, with all their subunits and full complement of weapons platforms and logistics for this gigantic mammoth invasion, the largest ever in human history. Between hours 4 and 5 of the invasion overall, as the first of the 112th Cav, a squadron or battalion-sized unit belonging to the 72nd Infantry Brigade Combat Team, had stuck to its original mission plan due to the urgency of the situation, as the rocket and long-range shells, 155 shells, WS-35R satellite-guided munitions, began to hit their temporary bivouac area, spurring them to move as they were heavily monitored by both drone and satellite. Plans were made by the PLA to intercept and destroy the first of the 112th. As previously shown, it was to be cut off in a tight pocket, prohibiting it from using its main advantage of mobility and its fairly potent firepower coming from its M1A2 main battle tanks, of which it had 2 heavy companies consisting of these armored forces of 14 main battle tanks apiece of the M1A2 varieties, as well as its 2 rifle companies consisting of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and M113 armor personnel carriers, as well as its headquarters platoons having LMTV trucks, M88 armored recovery vehicles, field trucks, and MRAPs. Being cut off within a small valley within a 2 by 2 mile total area, it was pummeled heavily by artillery strikes and even airstrikes coming from a lone J-16 fighter aircraft, now on its 3rd sortie, armed with heavy ground attack munitions, dropping 4 laser-guided 1,000-pound munitions on the lead tanks of the 1st Armored Company, or Heavy Company, of this squadron, the first of the 112th, traveling in a rolling H formation in order to protect its much lighter headquarters company and support company in the very middle, with the 2 rifle companies comprising the outside on their left flank moving south, and on their right flank the 2 heavy companies, as they were pummeled viciously by CH-901 loitering munitions armed with high explosive anti-tank warheads fired by the headquarters battalion of the 17th Infantry Division. as well as tank shells and HJ-10 long-range anti-tank missiles coming from the anti-tank company within the 1 battalion dispatched to the area by the 165th Armored Brigade. The 125 millimeter tank shells, of course, coming from their very advanced Type 96B main battle tanks. Type 69Bs also comprise the backbone of the 1 Armored Battalion belonging to the 17th ID, or Infantry Division, also tasked out with assisting to surround the American Cavalry Squadron, the first of the 112, from the southern end of the encirclement. And again, the reason for such a tight encirclement was to prohibit the American Cavalry Battalion Squadron from using its full advantages of maneuvering, as it was a unit designed with maneuver warfare in mind, by enclosing it to where it had limited options insofar as the capabilities of its vehicles were concerned. A battle plan put together due to the highly advanced artificial intelligence being utilized within the coalition forces, namely by the Chinese and the Russians, respectively. Also was a mechanized infantry division moving to block the western side of the T intersection, as the armored battalion, 2 of its armored companies here, and 2 armored infantry companies blocked the southeastern end, as well as the eastern end of this valley, enclosing and destroying them within the small area. As that had wrapped up in the valley, moving north upon crushing the first of the 112, the 17th Infantry Division proceeded to recon various ancillary and secondary routes along the way, wiping out anything that dared to put up any sort of resistance insofar as defending components were concerned, or fight back, or rather just even so much as make an attempt to even shoulder any sort of weapon system as it related to small arms to fight against the Chinese invasion forces. Civilians encountered were so horribly mauled. Whatever of they who survived the fighting somehow, insofar as their components, melted away into nature, hoping to even have an opportunity at living, much less to attempt to resist again another day. Simultaneously, as all of the aforementioned was occurring, forward battalions of the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division were rolling northeast and parallel to Interstate 35, even as the fighting downtown, as mentioned a bit earlier, was starting to wrap up. By this time, the 43rd Artillery Brigade was packed up and crossing into the USA and moving up Interstate 35 from the border. The 10th Signals Regiment and 10th Group Army's Independent Headquarters Battalion, or essentially the command elements of the entire Group Army within just that one battalion, separate from the other subunits comprising the whole 10th Group Army as a larger entity, all prepared to pack up to head north and northeast into the land. Other group armies following the 10th Group Army from behind their advance, we're also starting the process of entering via I-35 as well. Leaving the 10th Group Army and some of its components to act as a sort of rear guard element, as it was called, in order to mop up the last vestiges of resistance in the area to ensure safe travel up the interstate for the other group armies who were now themselves in a convoy formation, as a large, many miles long convoy was just now beginning to make their way to cross the bridge in Loredo and begin entering Interstate 35. This all being done as far as it related to the 10th Group Army wrapping up their operations in the area to ensure a smooth entry of the entire invasion prong into the land as a whole. Follow-up forces within the Loredo area would consist of savage PAP forces, or People's Armed Police paramilitary troops, hell-bent on carrying out so-called pacification operations, being a euphemism for the mass butchering of the populace, what's often called a genocide. In addition to such, many others would be taken into slavery to be employed in various forms of hard labor for the Chi-Coms. The final major struggle now ensued within the Loredo battle between the forces of the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division and one of its comprising battalions of mechanized infantry, of light mechanized infantry forces, up against the final American defenders in the area, the now sitting ducks, as the saying goes, of the 3rd of the 141st Infantry Regiment. Having stayed upon their forward operating bases, unsure of what was exactly occurring around them, lacking communications or any real contact with the outside world due to a loss of military networks, satellites, and even local communications in the forms of their radios, as these were now being jammed since the beginning of the invasion by the 10th Signals Regiment, who themselves were to begin packing up to cross the border, in addition to the other units that were crossing, such as the 38th Air Defense Artillery Brigade and the 43rd Artillery Brigade, as well as the forces of the 17th ID and 165th Armored Brigade, who by this point, before this battle, had converged and entered I-35 itself to lead the entire convoy, with their heavily armored forces being at the forefront of the entire convoy up the interstate, while the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division stayed to fend off attacking civilian forces who were horribly defeated and mauled, with few survivors escaping, along with clearing the right side of the highway, or the eastern side of the highway, engaging in battle against the 3rd of the 141st Infantry Regiment at its grouping of forward operation bases, also having been in the past themselves constructed by the 172nd Brigade Engineering Battalion, now a unit that had already been destroyed in the opening hours of the invasion. At this particular battle, within this 3 by 2 mile area, just one segment of a larger battle now erupting between this battalion, this 3rd of the 141st Infantry Regiment, who had a handful of company-sized forward operating bases of such designs scattered several miles up and down Interstate 35, originally intending to monitor the interstate as it pertained to previous border operations, being within very close proximity of less than 2 miles from the interstate itself, with the FOBs being scattered up and down, branching off of farm roads that themselves branched off the interstate and its access roads running parallel to it. As the armored and mechanized infantry and even artillery elements of the 10th Group Army were now convoying in convoy formation, each company of each battalion now lined up in a massive, many miles long convoy. Some of the 43rd Artillery Brigades, artillery battalions, subordinate companies here, trucks and their towed howitzers moving up the interstate. The 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Divisions, subordinate battalions comprising it, and their subordinate companies comprising each of these larger battalions that comprise the division, were now clearing both sides of the interstate as they were engaged against groupings of armed civilians who made feeble attempts to fight back, as they were not only horribly outnumbered and outgunned, but the armed civilians had no reconnaissance capabilities of their own, apart from sending out very small groups of scouts who were seen from quadcopter recon drones and thus were found, engaged, and destroyed by the much more heavily armed forces of the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division. Having had thus dropped off 2 infantry squads of dismounts from their respective armor personnel carriers of the WZ-551 varieties, as shown here, this being only one mechanized infantry company belonging to one battalion, which belonged itself to the larger 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division. Also was this specific battalion of the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division and its one anti-tank company belonging to the battalion of WZ-550 four-wheeled anti-tank vehicles, each carrying 4 HJ-09 anti-tank missiles apiece. They would contribute to the fighting against the 3rd of the 141st Infantry Regiment of the American National Guard forces defending the opposite side of the interstate, or attempting to. At this farm, upon these 2 dismounted squads having engaged and eliminated these 2 scouts attempting to obtain information on enemy forces now traveling up the access roads and highways respectively, as it related to the forces now convoying up the highways up the Interstate 35 itself, there was a small exchange of fire between this one squad and these two scouting civilians here, only to end in their elimination before these two dismounted squads continued their bounding and covering, with this one peeling down this somewhat steep hill here before getting on top of this lower hill to support this squad, who continued cautiously bounding and covering before reaching this barn and splitting into two groups between just this one squad of 5 men apiece, led by the squad leader and subordinate corporal being a junior sergeant and corporal. The junior sergeant being the squad leader and the corporal being the subordinate NCO below him, each taking 4 soldiers beneath them, splitting up and going around 2 different sides of this barn in order to engage enemies that their quadcopter recon drone had spotted out in the open, insofar as their single squad's own small quadcopter reconnaissance drone. There were 2 silos for storing feed and grains, 2 barns, a farmhouse, and a large storage shed. As this one Chinese squad went around 2 different sides of the barn, it was engaged upon reaching this corner and this corner, engaged by a single civilian firing from this direction from around the shed, who was also likewise engaged by this group of 5 here and destroyed, along with another trying to peer around this barn and fire this way, who likewise was engaged and destroyed, as this grouping here tossed a hand grenade around the corner and eliminated these 2, as they were already seen, and it was known where they were hiding as far as behind this barn by the quadcopter recon drone, before then advancing around this barn and this barn, but not before they sent a pair of soldiers to look into the barn, who themselves went and checked this barn before returning to each of their squads, coming out 2 different entryways into the barn itself. They having, of course, broken boards to get in, as well as doing the same to this one before going out each side and returning to their respective 2 half squad elements that were broken off the original squad, or 2 basic stack team elements, which were 5 apiece. Upon reaching the ends of these structures, reaching here, they engaged and eliminated a single-armed civilian who tried to run to this corner of the barn, but was engaged by 2 members of this half of this Chinese squad doing a high-low around the corner, which a high-low is where a soldier crouches and another stands above him, and they both peer around the corner at the same time, one looking this way and one looking this way, to cover any conceivable angle around a corner, engaging and eliminating this single-armed civilian before then converging on the farmhouse to clear it, along with the other half squad who went through this way and this half squad going through this way, both returning and forming a single 10-man squad again upon going around to recheck this storage shed before rechecking the barns and then holding their position there, as this other dismounted squad held its overwatch position on the hill, where it could not only watch the goings-on the property, but could also watch this farm road that led up to the highway. All while this was already going on here, and the convoys of massive numbers of troops were going up the interstate, you already had a single light mechanized infantry company in just this one sector of the larger battle, as there were additional American FOBs besides just two shown here, one already being hit by massive airstrikes from 1,000-pound munitions that were already dropped, with two more following up to be dropped as this aircraft is quickly moving. And by the time each of these aircraft reaches here, they drop two more 1,000-pound munitions, which fly down and hit their targets. In addition to the munitions dropped, this particular J-16 fighter jet has fired a pair of air-to-ground missile systems to likewise hit some of these command buildings and portable buildings on the forward operating base itself here, which caused massive destruction. And likewise, the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division's headquarters battalion and their drone sections fired another volley of 48 CH-901s, which were not only in this specific area of the battle space, but were to the north and to the south, engaging other forces and other forward operating bases, also being engaged by other companies of this same battalion, as well as companies belonging to other battalions, engaging and fighting against not just the forces, but the FOBs themselves, as a few were not hit by airstrikes, but instead were being engaged by ground forces. And the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division's artillery, their divisional artillery battalions, had already just packed up and were moving north from Mexico to join the rest of their division, who had already fought their way through Loredo and was now to the slight northeast of Loredo at this last battle here, engaging the final defending unit, the 3rd of the 141st. Now, they intended originally to set up a new firing position inside of the smashed city of Loredo, perhaps in some of its parking areas that were formerly used by the 3rd of the 138th, which was a unit that had originally camped out inside the city in many of these parking areas, which was now destroyed by the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division and some of its battalions further back and earlier in the battle. They were intending to set up a new firing point and give fire mission support to their forces already here fighting in the field, but this battle would be over so quick, they literally wouldn't even have time to do so. And thus, it would not be necessary to do so, as again, these forces were on a highly strict timetable and were in a large rush to advance deeper inland. So, as time was of the essence, these forces made it a point to wrap up this battle as quickly and easily as possible. The WZ-551 infantry fighting vehicle and armor personnel carrier versions were busily supporting their now dismounted infantry squads, many in wedge formations, bounding and covering each other in order to reach some of the higher ground, as well as to get into positions on lower ground to engage these American mechanized infantry forces with man-portable anti-tank weapon systems, as well as various small arms at their disposal, including their light machine guns, such as their QJY-201 5.8 by 42 millimeter light machine guns, belt-fed and carried in drums beneath the LMGs, as well as their QBZ 95 assault rifles of the same caliber. Not to mention, of course, their crew serve weapons on top of their armor personnel carriers themselves, and of course their 25mm autocannons on their IFV variants of these WZ-551s. Now, due to the firepower carried by these American forces, much like in their ambush against such in the city, these mechanized infantry forces of the Americans did possess some Bradley infantry fighting vehicles with tow missile systems as well as their 20mm autocannons, which the tow could be devastating, especially against these Chi-Com vehicles, especially being that these were lighter vehicles and not heavier tracked vehicles, as these were wheeled. They still had decent armor, but they weren't quite as well protected as heavier tracked armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, and were designed with being lighter and faster in mind. But these tow systems could definitely destroy them with ease. And therefore, it was absolutely necessary to dismount their infantry squads for these infantry squads to go ahead of them, with the vehicles sitting back, taking full advantage of their more ranged weapons, such as the 25mm autocannons and the heavy crew serve 12.7mm machine guns, which were essentially a 50 caliber machine gun, to give mobile fire support from behind the squads due to the high range of these weapons, while the squads foraged ahead and provided their infantry support to their vehicles, while their vehicles provided them with longer range fire support, mutually supporting one another. Thus, the dismounted infantry squads that moved ahead were able to protect their vehicles like their vehicles were able to support them from further back with longer range, more powerful weapons. As these dismounted infantry squads, therefore, were sent ahead to engage the potent American infantry fighting vehicles, especially because they were doing so to prevent these American vehicles from firing their tow missile systems at their own infantry fighting vehicle and armor personnel vehicle versions of the WZ-551s that they were formerly mounted up in, belonging to their platoon, as each platoon had 5 vehicles: an infantry fighting vehicle and 4 armor personnel carrier versions of the WZ-551s. So, moving ahead, getting on the high ground, observing the battlefield in front of them, these forces fired man-portable HJ-08 anti-tank systems at any Bradley that they saw before them on the field of battle, in order to prevent the Bradleys from even starting to be able to fire tow systems at their own vehicles, and thereby protecting them from said systems. As the Americans were already at a severe disadvantage in this fight because of no ISR capabilities of their own, having lost again all their satellites, all of their military networks due to the cyber attack, along with the anti-satellite attack blinding them from the skies, as well as their satellite data transfers of information, and their GPS, which many of their weapon systems depended on. Unable to see what was in front of them until they got within visual range, the American forces, also lacking effective communications due to the electronic warfare jamming being levied upon them from the 10th Group Army's 10th Signals Regiment and their electronic warfare battalion jamming their signals, they essentially only had line of sight communications whereby they could send runners between vehicles and between squads to basically coordinate attacks within very localized areas as anything beyond immediate visual range would take far too much time and would be extremely risky, as they would have to cross a battlefield full of loitering munitions looking for targets such as these CH-901s, as you see here, that are airborne and about to hit vehicles, as well as dodging the myriad of fire coming not just from infantry small arms, but also from heavier weapons like 25mm cannons from the Chi-Com infantry fighting vehicle versions of the WZ-551s, as well as 12.7mm fire, which was completely devastating, not only to lighter vehicles, but also to individuals themselves, which could literally blast a man almost in half. As the fighting continued, and this southernmost platoon advanced with their now dismounted infantry forces being engaged by American armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, the Chi-Coms did suffer some casualties, although not very much, as again, the Americans were at a severe disadvantage from the standpoint of ISR and also being able to ascertain targets as a result of such, and having to move within very close visual range of their targets, often being hit first by HJ-08 anti-tank missile systems fired by these infantry forces, as well as the longer-ranged, further back systems of 25mm fire and 12.7, roughly 50 caliber fire, essentially from further back as well, from the gunners and the turrets of the WZ-551 APC versions. The platoon just to the north of the farthest south platoon in this one little excerpt of this larger battle was likewise now engaging in combat with an American platoon who already lost a vehicle to a CH-901 armed with a heat warhead, or high explosive anti-tank warhead, that went straight for their platoon's Bradley IFV, leaving only APCs and the dismounts to really fight back. All the while, as fire support came from the vehicles, some of the vehicles had to move into better firing positions, as the hilly terrain did block some of their weapons from being able to hit forces or vehicles on the other side of which. Therefore, a WZ-551 APC moved itself into position also to provide some cover for their dismounted squad itself, who was moving just beside them and beginning to advance up the hilly terrain. As this was occurring, this advancing squad of Americans was completely wiped out by the turret gunner on the APC here, as well as these forces taking fire as they advanced and got up the hill, or began to come up the side slope of it, now engaging in very close quarters combat with this Chi-Com squad, who likewise was advancing up the hill, getting to within grenade range of one another, both sides tossing hand grenades and firing small arms at each other, alongside of fire support from this armored personnel carrier, hitting a few of the American troops that dared even get on the summit of this particular hill right here. The fire from the 12.7mm was then levied upon this armored personnel carrier, shredding it into pieces and eliminating its gunner and driver. As this squad here proceeded towards the hill, it too now began taking fire from a few different angles, as all of this was occurring roughly at the same time, from everything going on in the south to everything here and north of it. But this particular armored personnel carrier moved here to support the advance of their dismounted squad, likewise moving up the hill, but now itself taking some fire, not just from this squad that had since been destroyed originally, taking fire from it, but also taking fire from this advancing squad and American gunners on their remaining armored personnel carriers that hadn't as of yet been immediately destroyed. As this squad moved up, they turned to give assistance to their fourth and final squad of their platoon of 4 squads here, while also in a wedge formation themselves, trying to fight back against this attacking squad of PLA troops, these forces remaining in their wedge formation so that they could levy fire from this way or this way, sort of like in the shape of an arrow, such as this. They were firing against this squad moving up the hill. They were also firing literally at this armored personnel carrier right here that was also now lending its fire support from its turret gunner against this squad, as some of its troops actually got high enough on the summit, and although they were crouched and trying to stay as low as they could, were torn apart by 12.7 millimeter fire, as this hill really didn't have very many places to hide behind, minus a few large rocks and other such formations, they being completely now destroyed. While this squad of this platoon was going around as they dismounted from their IFV, or infantry fighting vehicle, and went around this squad here, who was moving into position to also assault the hill from its northern flank, while this squad temporarily paused here before bounding again to go around the hill and engage and destroy this infantry fighting, this armored personnel carrier with an HJ-08 man-portable anti-tank missile, which they did. All the while, this squad, at the same time, bounded and was engaged by this squad, who was already reaching the summit. And this squad then broke up into 2 different components, which did a fishhook maneuver whereby 5 men and 5 men, upon getting up here on this side of the hill, went around to attack the flanks of this wedge formation, while this grouping of 5 did the same, and then went around again to hit them like this. And as this squad was now trapped, being hit from 2 different sides with constantly shifting fire, as this group of 5 bounded around again, staying very low. And as they bounded, what would occur is you'd have a few men firing while a few men bounded and fired, and a few more bounded and fired. It was like a leapfrogging action when they did this double fishhook. This will be shown in a later video, how this maneuver works on a smaller type of map, where it will show specifically how soldiers shoot and move while conducting this specific maneuver, as well as other tactical maneuvers such as urban building clearance operations and field tactics, as far as fighting in the open, in wilderness type terrain or outdoor type terrain that's not urban. As these double fishhook maneuvers were conducted, these troops were getting hit from so many angles that eventually they succumbed and were destroyed. All while this other squad, again, had gone around and began firing HJ-08 anti-tank missile systems at some of the couple surviving armor personnel carriers, M113s, that still remained, that weren't destroyed by CH-901s, which had as priority targets Bradleys in particular, as M113 APCs were a lower priority target insofar as vehicles were concerned for the CH-901 loitering munitions and for the troops in the field wielding anti-tank systems. All while this was occurring, and their anti-tank company, which is right here, advanced up the access road on the other side of the interstate. The anti-tank company turned abruptly and drove as quickly as they could to reach the combat in this area to support this whole mechanized infantry company out of one battalion who was conducting the combat in this area of the entire battle as a whole, as there was a much larger battle with other FOBs to the north and to the south being engaged. Just these two here were being engaged in this one portion of the battle, this one having been destroyed by very powerful airstrikes, and this one about to be destroyed by powerful airstrikes, with support troops running to and fro, as this was the FOB of the actual headquarters company of the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment, which, fortunately for them, in some ways, it could be said, not all of their entire battalion had been destroyed, and some companies did manage to flee the FOBs themselves right before airstrikes or CH-901 loitering munition strikes and other types of weapons platforms had been wielded against their specific combat outposts / FOBs, which were now under attack. So that is why there is even some mechanized infantry forces engaged in this battle. Roughly one company versus one company, at least until the anti-tank company came under this interstate bridge here and advanced rapidly to give its support, to fire not just at the American FOB itself, but before even doing so, they started to fire at the American vehicles. By the time they reached here, about 500 meters away, they started firing at every vehicle they could conceivably see. As they came in a double column formation, the two lead vehicles fired at the platoon here, destroying all of its remaining vehicles after the CH-901 already destroyed its Bradley, which made it very safe, or relatively more safe, for the AT company to come down this road, as it was restricted in its maneuvering due to the hilly terrain on both sides of the road, and therefore had to stay roadbound, at least for the time being. And it was supported by infantry forces anyhow of this platoon right here of 5 squads, as one squad was already right here firing anti-tank systems at this platoon, in addition to the CH-901 striking its Bradley system with a heat warhead. On this side of the road, this platoon right here was trying to engage this platoon whose forces had split up and taken different sides of this hill to assault. And as this was occurring, again, their Bradley had already since been destroyed by this CH-901 strike, which allowed for the safe or relatively safe movement of the company of W50 anti-tank systems to roll under the highway bridge and advance up the farm road to begin to engage vehicles, and then the fob a bit later, although the fob was about to be destroyed by 4 different 1,000-pound munitions in addition to the missile strikes already fired from this J-16 from much further back, from miles back, as the smoke trails indicate, before getting here, dropping their munitions, and flying off. Just this one pair out of the 12 aircraft belonging to the J-16 squadron. All as this occurred, the platoon here, it's 5 vehicles and dismounted squads belonging, it's 1 squad per vehicle, made an attempt to seize this very vital high ground here, as their reconnaissance small quadcopter drones, as well as much higher flying drones and satellite ISR assets, could see that American forces were trying to capture the hill as well, so they could have a much better observation post over the entire battle space, as this was a very steep ridgeline of consisting of large hills relatively high up, to where they rose above not just the highway, but also over watching their forward operating bases, which this one was about to literally be destroyed at the opening of just showing this very map itself, as this one had just been destroyed just to the south of it. This one was imminently destroyed due to the missile strikes and 4 1,000-pound munition strikes, as well as the vehicles rapidly moving in, destroying this platoon's remaining armored personnel carriers before firing its missiles at this forward operating base. You have to understand, everything in this battle, what was going on over here already shown, what was going on here was happening extremely rapidly. You must understand that. All of this was happening within roughly 20 minutes. This was not a very long battle at all. From the time of the opening of this map and the destruction of this fob as the map opens, and the missiles flying, and these aircraft dropping their munitions here, all of that happened in less than a minute. This place was nearly all destroyed, and by the time these guys rolled up from this company here and began firing their AT missiles and destroying these APCs before firing it at the whatever remained of the smoky cratered area that was a fob here, all of that happened, at least from the time of the beginning of this to when they rolled up and started firing, and this going on here, all of this happened, all of it, from beginning to this point, all of that happened within a span of approximately under 15 minutes. The first minute was the destruction of the fobs, and then it took them approximately 10 minutes to go from this side at full speed to make it about a mile to get here and fire their systems, because they were traveling quickly to get there to reinforce the forces already fighting here, fighting over higher ground to prevent them from getting a view over the battlefield and trying to fire on their vehicles, which is the purpose of the dismounts, trying to guard their vehicles while their vehicles also supported them with the heavier firepower from 25 millimeter as well as 12.7 crew serves. Their priority was to destroy the more powerful Bradley vehicles to prevent them from firing tow systems as well, as it related to the CH-901s. And while this battle on the hill was occurring, at the same exact time as all of this, it was imperative for these forces, it was highly important, paramount, that this platoon prevented American forces from trying to get on the hill, not just have a panoramic view of this local battle space, but also potentially firing tow systems or javelins at lighter vehicles, like these artillery trucks pulling these howitzers, these artillery supply trucks of this towed artillery unit pulling their howitzers, towing them behind. These are towed howitzers being convoyed up the interstate. It was imperative that these forces prevented, that's the whole purpose of clearing the areas adjacent to the interstate. These forces had to prevent the Americans from capturing the high ground and thus being able to be a threat to the larger invasion operation as a whole, because if they did hit and destroy lighter vehicles, it would bottleneck this entire invasion route for hours. It would take hours to clear it because all these vehicles clogging up the interstate. And you have to understand, abandoned vehicles along the interstate were being brushed aside by these tanks and heavier vehicles that were leading the entire convoy, because you had the 165th Armor Brigade further up, and the 17th and the Artillery Brigade. I mean, this was miles and miles long of vehicles, and they had to brush aside abandoned civilian vehicles, and they used their tanks for that, as they could crush or just push them to the side easily. And they had to prevent these forces from getting on the high ground that overlooked the highway from not very far away. I mean, we're talking less than a kilometer away at this narrow point right here. And thus being able to fire tow systems or perhaps even javelins at these lighter vehicles. And that would cause a major wrench being thrown into the timeline of the invasion, wrapping up as fast as it was. And that could not be permitted whatsoever at all. So this platoon carried out their mission and advanced up the hilly ground, clashing with these American companies, or these American squads of this company, of each of these two platoons, because the last other mechanized infantry platoon in the area was over here. And what you have going on here is you have the two vehicles here, both being armor personnel carriers, M113s, having already had dropped off their forces. They began to maneuver between this steep hilly ground and their headquarters companies forward operating base, now smashed into dust. And as they moved around it, they were being engaged from this high ground right here. They were being fired upon as they were maneuvering right here, as the red indicates there. And by the time both had reached here, they were hit by these two circling CH-901 loitering munitions, which targeted and destroyed both of them. These forces that had already been dismounted from their M113s and Bradley IFV respectively were likewise charging uphill to support the other platoon here of the company doing the same. Now, as these forces advanced lower on the hilly terrain here and here, this one Chi-Com squad was being engaged by two squads of Americans, and thus this squad actually suffered 2 KIAs and several wounded, but they fought as hard as they could. Even despite having their advantages, they were still outnumbered, which caused the few casualties. And they eliminated both of these squads here, firing everything they had at them, including light anti-armor rockets, such as armor personnel rockets fired from their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade systems, essentially, as well as barrel-fired grenades from beneath their QBZ-95 rifles, 25mm grenades, and also their light machine guns and rifle fire. And they eliminated these two squads here. Now, beyond doing so, they advanced to the bottom of this lower part of the hill, and they held their position here to at least cover this area. While this armored personnel carrier rolled uphill as high as they could actually go and stopped right here, while their 12.7 millimeter gunner tried to provide fire support, firing a bit uphill. As they couldn't go any higher, they fired a bit uphill, firing at whatever they could conceivably reach, while their dismounted squad went around going up and down these hilly areas. You have to understand there's different variations of rolling hills and steeper and not as steep hilly terrain here. This is a large ridge in general of various hilly terrain. And they were being engaged also by this squad that had been destroyed by the one further down. They were able to give some support during that fighting. Again, there's so much going on in this, it's hard to show it all in any sort of coherent order, because this is exactly how a real battle would be. You would have so many occurrences going on, it would be hard to put it in any sort of order, because there's so many things occurring simultaneously. And upon having been destroyed from the fire from uphill and from this squad that lost a few troops, they went around, and after firing between this squad and these two, this squad and this armored personnel carrier, firing its 12.7 at these from across this little spur, or draw rather, in the hilly terrain, they fired their heavy machine gun at these two squads of this platoon that were trying to advance up this steep hill, and they were fired at all the way as they advanced from this APC that managed to get up here, this WZ-551. Now, being that WZ-551s were lighter wheeled vehicles, they had better maneuverability uphill than many tracked vehicles, hence the ability for it to even get this high up. But this hilly terrain here on this ridge was just too steep, and they couldn't get up here. So they did the best they could, and they fired across this little draw here and hit many of these troops with their heavy weapons, while this squad likewise was engaged here and here. Being in a wedge formation, it could give fire support to this squad down lower, as well as fire from the other side of its wedge. These five guys firing at the forces trying to advance uphill. And upon having done so, the wheeled vehicle stayed on the lower hilly terrain and went and held position on this part of the hill here, while their very own dismounted squad did the same thing to provide mutual support to one another, but they were no longer being engaged because they had destroyed the American forces, at least on this part of the ridge. Now, these two dismounted squads went up to the highest point on the ridge here, and as they had an overwatch of this whole area, and behind them was the highway, which they could also see if they were to turn around, this squad here provided support to the other squad that went up the hill with it, right here. This squad here went uphill, this squad here went uphill. And both were engaged at this point in a firefight with this American squad here from two high up hills. Now, this squad remained up here to give fire support, while this squad bounded and covered and then broke into two parts of 5 men apiece from its 10-man squad and did another double fish hook here and here, destroying what remained of this squad, having also been lit up from here to give support while these guys moved earlier. They destroyed this squad within grenade range, or even bayonet range in many cases, with a few instances of vicious hand-to-hand combat occurring, as they were extremely close by this point during the double fishhook firing and maneuvering, and then reformed as a full squad and raced to the summit of this hill upon this larger ridge formation here, as you can see. It's a large ridge, two sides of it with lower sloping hills here that build up to a higher sloping hill, which had a few different high summits on it, on the ridge itself, as shown. And these two dismounted squads raced uphill as well, and were likewise engaging additional three American squads that had also gone up this hill from this platoon here, while this fourth and final one, as just shown, had been destroyed by the double fishhook maneuvering squad with fire support coming from this other squad that both went uphill together initially. And they could now, this squad here, after destroying this one, was now freed up to hit the flanks of this squad that raced uphill, while this other squad and this squad were firing in an L shape, closing L type formation, where one squad went up like this and the other squad went up like this until they linked up in an L shape, where they had a limit of advance where neither squad would advance any further, as both squads were now in a line formation, and if either squad advanced any further, there was a risk of friendly fire as far as the L was concerned. When they closed the L, they had gotten within close range of the American squad's remains and vectored their firepower in two different interlocking fields of fire and thus eliminated them, as the arrow shows. The green arrow being surrounded by red means that they were destroyed by the Chi-Coms. Right there. Closing L. Firing this way and this way. Now lower on the hill, this other squad went up around while the fighting was on the summit with the closing L, and they stayed low to avoid the fire coming from this direction. Upon having engaged and destroyed the fourth and final squad of this original platoon here, they engaged them from lower on the ridge as they tried to go around the summit area of this part of the hill on this ridge. And they were engaged in a firefight where this squad was destroyed due to this squad having already reconned the area with their quadcopter drone. They knew that they were coming around and they set up an ambush and wiped them out in a firefight. And then they proceeded uphill and stayed low while the closing L firefight was going on between this squad here advancing and this squad here advancing, having destroyed both in their closing L interlocking field of fire. This squad lower that engaged and destroyed the fourth and last one, they stayed low, weren't hit by any friendly fire, in the prone position on lower elevation, and they were not engaged as there was no green around this arrow. They had reached the limit of their advance, and they stayed where they were in order to have overwatch of this area in case any surviving American forces were to come into the area, as did all the other squads. Holding this high ground, again, was paramount. It was of paramount importance. It was critical. It was dire, as this high ground overlooked the interstate, where potentially, if even one vehicle had been eliminated on this massively miles-long convoy, it would take quite a long time to clear the wreckage and send an armored recovery vehicle up the interstate amid all the destroyed American vehicles that were abandoned that had to be plowed out of the way by the lead tank with a bulldozer on it, with a bulldozer type implement equipped to the front of it. That would take an immense amount of time to clear. So thus, had the battle ended with yet another Chi-Com victory, with this one being somewhat hard fought, with there being a handful of casualties on the Chi-Com side, but yet another destroyed full American battalion as a result, as the casualties were often extremely lopsided due to the Chi-Com advantages in every area with ISR and weapons superiority and size superiority, and their tactics employed just being far superior to anything that the defenders had at this time. And therefore, were the defenders destroyed. And the battle at Loredo came to an end, with Sino-Russian coalition forces in the form of this invasion prong of these 7 PLA group armies advancing deep inland into the American heartland itself. The next battle that will be covered will be the battle at Penitas Ranches, literally in the battle space just to the north of Loredo. This one being handled by elements of the 3rd and 4th Corps of the 2nd Mobile Contingent of the People's Armed Police, a fanatical paramilitary, heavily armed force. They're not your typical gendarmeries that many nations have insofar as paramilitary. These were a very heavily armed paramilitary force with artillery, some heli-borne elements, even their own special operations forces, sort of like the Snow Leopard Commando Unit, which was also involved in this campaign, as mentioned in 96 Hour Invasion documentary series, as well as artillery forces, armored personnel carriers, even light tanks. Yes, they were not just given arrest powers, but they were also an element that had counterinsurgency as far as one of its major skill sets. And they were even fully armed and equipped to take on actual full-scale combat against regular military units of enemy nations. And their part of these operations at the border will be reviewed in the next battle series of this larger documentary of the South Central Invasion Sector, as prongs of invasion forces were crossing in many areas throughout the whole nation, from north and south, from Canada, Mexico, and beach landings. But in just this South Central sector, so large were the invasion forces that there were many massive engagements in just this one tri-state area as it related to the whole invasion, seeing far more ground troops involved than many other sectors of the invasion, with only a few other additional major areas in the invasion as a whole coming even close to this central sector in terms of the ground forces involved. The series will continue in the next video. The Battle of Dolores West Penitas Ranches.